Okay, so let's start. The molecule that functions as a reducing agent donor in a redox or oxidation reduction reaction, how they are called. So to answer this question, the first thing that we need to do is to know what is a reducing agent. So a reducing agent is an element or a compound that loses an electron. So it is donating an electron. So let me show you here in this schematic. Here you have this compound A, and if you see it here, it's going to lose electrons. So it's going to get oxidized. So here you don't have electrons anymore. On the other hand, an oxidizing agent is the one that instead of losing, it gains electrons. So here, in the beginning, here the compound B doesn't have any electron, but it's going to gain electron, so it's going to be reduced. So remember, this is a reducing agent. That is the one that loosens the electrons. So the answer here will be the one that loses the electrons and lose the potential energy, because the electrons are the one that give the energy to do different reactions. Now this question, when electrons move closer to a more electronegative atoms, what happened? Okay, so the answer here, it will be A. And I will start explaining this answer in two components. First, I will explain this. The more electronegative atom is reduced, and then I will explain why energy is released. So let's start with the first one. So to do that, I want that you see this chemical reaction. Here you have molecular oxygen, and here you have a hydrogen. And as you can see, as oxygen is so electronegative, the electrons are getting closer to the oxygen, so it's gaining electrons. So this one definitely is reduced. So the oxygen is reduced. So the more electronegative atom, what is going to happen is going to be reduced. So that is easy. Now let's see what happened. What happened with the energy? So as we said before, for example, during respiration, you have glucose, and you have a molecule. The molecule of glucose has a high kinetic energy, while these molecules, like carbon dioxide and water, have a lower kinetic energy. So you move from a complex molecule to a smaller molecule, simpler molecules, and as a result of that, you release energy. So what is going to happen is not only that the more electronegative atom is reduced, but also you're going to release energy. So the answer again is A. So here again, this one is the right answer. And this one B is wrong because energy is not consumed. The more electronegative atom is oxidized. This is wrong. The more electronegative, this is wrong. And the more electronegative is reduced, and the entropy is never going to decrease. So this is wrong. So as you can see, the only answer is this one, that both of the components of the question are correct. Okay, so this question, which of the following statements describe the result of this reaction? So the first thing to answer this question is that the first step is that you recognize what is this process. So you have here a carbohydrate, possibly glucose. You have oxygen. Take oxygen, and as a result, you release water, CO2, and energy. So this process is respiration. Yeah, and I explained photosynthesis in the video lecture. So if you watch that, you will be able to answer this question. This is just the opposite. So here, as I said before, this question asks about respiration, but I already explained photosynthesis in the video lecture. and you can see in the textbook that they explain this. So it's the same thing. If you see here you have CO2 and here you have carbon. So here what is happening is that this is going in the opposite direction. So let's try to answer it together. Why do you think that the glucose is oxidized and the oxygen is reduced? So let's try to answer it together. So if you read your textbook, and as we have been talking here, what happened during cellular respiration is that you take this glucose that have a high kinetic energy and you oxidize it, and as a result you remove these hydrogens and these become oxidized, so have a lower kinetic energy. On the other hand, the oxygen now is not sharing more electrons with the other oxygen, now it's sharing the electrons with the hydrogen, so now it will have a higher kinetic energy compared to the oxygen, and this become reduced. So let's see now, try to see this in terms of electrons. Okay, so now let's try to see the electrons. So here we have the glucose, and let's see what happened with the carbon dioxide. So try to see what happened with the electrons. So well, here in the glucose, if you see here, the electrons are in between hydrogen and carbon. In the CO2, the oxygen is much closer to the oxygen. So in other words, the carbon is losing electrons. Yeah, before they were close in the glucose, now they are far in the CO2. So again, here they are almost in the middle. So before they were closed, so as they were closed, the glucose, it was more negative. The carbon here, it was more negative. Now they are far. The electrons are far, so it's just slightly negative. So before it was more negative, now it's less negative. So as it's losing electrons, is being oxidized. So electrons are pulled far from the carbon, and as a result, the carbon is being oxidized. Okay, now let's see what happened with the oxygen and with the water. So if you see the electrons in the oxygen, both are in the middle because both molecules are, both oxygens are very electronegative, but they pull the electrons with the same force. However, with the water, something different happened. Now all the electrons are very close to the oxygen. So here we have that it was less negative because the electrons were far from them, while here are more negative. Let's put more negative because the electrons are very close to the oxygen. So here they are closer again, remember? So they are more negative, and I told you that this one are far, so here are just slightly negative. And as a result, what is happening here is this. The oxygen is being reduced because it's gaining electrons. So electrons are pulled close to the oxygen, so the oxygen is being reduced. So as a result, A is the correct answer because the carbohydrates, the glucose, is being oxidized while the oxygen is being reduced. Okay, this question is very interesting and is actually very similar to what we just did. And here they're asking you when a glucose molecule loses a hydrogen, okay, hydrogen atom as a result of the oxidation reduction reaction, the molecule becomes. Okay, so to do that, the the best way to see that is trying to see all the formula. Okay, let's use a formula. So here in the respiration, they are losing all the hydrogens, so the 12. However, it's the same principle. If you lose the hydrogens in a glucose, the molecule start becoming more oxidized. And maybe with the schematic, it will be easier to understand. So it's the same principle. And what happened here is that the carbon right now is sharing, for example, with this hydrogen, the electron. If you lose this hydrogen, you start going to have to fight these electrons with the molecules that have more oxygen, and oxygen is going to always win and gain those electrons. So the carbon is going to end up losing electrons. So in other words, well, before the hydrogens were closer to the carbon, so it was close, so it was more negative because the electrons were close to the carbon. Later, as they lose electrons, as they lose the hydrogens, the electrons are going to be far from the carbon. They are be closer to the oxygen molecules, and they are going to be only slightly negative. They're going to be less negative. So as a result, the electrons are going to be pulled far from the carbon, and the carbon is going to be oxidized. Okay, so this question we already answered it before, but let's try to answer it again. Why does the oxidation of an organic compound by a molecular oxygen to produce CO2 and water release free energy? Okay, so this is the answer. The answer will be A, because as we said before, glucose, when it's oxidized, it produces carbon dioxide and water. So it's a catabolic reaction where you go from a more complex molecule to simpler molecules. And as a result, it will release energy because the glucose has a more kinetic energy than the carbon dioxide and the water. Okay, so here we know that the answer is A, as I just explained it. Let's try to see if we can analyze the other options and see which one are correct and which one are incorrect. So electrons are being moved from atoms that have a lower affinity for electrons to atoms with a higher affinity for electrons. So if you remember the periodic table, oxygen is very electronegative, and their atoms, so this will be the one that have a higher affinity to pull these electrons. And although this is true, this is not answering why this caused the releasing energy. So the best answer here is A so far. Although this is correct, it's not answering the question. C, the oxidation of organic compounds can be used to make ATP. So we said that glucose can be oxidized to CO2, and as a result, you can produce ATP. That is true. However, in this case, this is not answering properly the question. Here, A is much more complete question. So here is, although it's correct, the answer A is much better. So now let's see D. The electrons have a higher potential energy when associated with water and CO2, and do they have organic compounds? So again, this is not the best. This A is superior. And finally, the covalent bonds of oxygen is unstable. So remember, when you have molecular oxygen, here you have a very stable bond. Both are very electronegative, and they really like to keep their electrons. So they are not easily broken. So all this one is not correct. So here, this is a difficult question, and the best answer definitely was A, although there were answers, there were other options that they were correct, but they don't actually answer the question. Now let's try to answer some of these questions about cell respiration. This question we already answered, but let's do it again. Most of the ATP produced during cellular respiration come from which of the following process? So I'm sure that you know that E is the correct answer. And I want to show you something very interesting is that depending on the textbook, if it's a relatively older book, they will tell you that the total ATP from the oxidative phosphorylation was 32. In your textbook, it will be between 26 to 28. And it's because scientists calculated again, and they think that this is closer to the right amount of ATP. But the main idea is that right now, as your textbook said that, use this one. But the idea is that it is most of the ATP, so there's produced a lot during the phosphorative oxidative phosphorylation. That is the key point. So as you can see in your textbook, only 2 ATPs are produced here, 2 in the Krebs cycle, and 26 to 28, depending if you use NADH or FADH2 as an electron carrier. You can produce more if you use this one. So as we said, the glycolysis produces ATP as well as the Krebs cycle, but the majority is produced by the ATP. And yes, maybe this could be a question in a test. There's substrate level phosphorylation. And this substrate level phosphorylation, they take place both here in the glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, and in those one you use an enzyme and a substrate to produce a product and to produce ATP. So this is produced just very little amount of ATP, but remember this could be in the test. So now let's answer this question. In the overall process of glycolysis and cellular respiration, what is oxidized and what is reduced? Okay, so we already studied this. So glucose is oxidized and oxygen is reduced. So here you can see glucose is oxidized because it loses hydrogen atoms, while oxygen gain hydrogen atoms, so it's reduced. So this one is it's not a complicated question, but if you discard and reject some of the answers, so let's try to do it together. They're asking you for the correct description of both the events of cellular respiration and their sequence. So if you remember here, they're going to try to play with you with the name of the process or describing what the process is. So for example, if you remember what is glycolysis, they can tell you that the first process is glycolysis, like here, but they can in C, they tell you that what is glycolysis when you take glucose and you oxidate it and you produce pyruvate. Yeah, so is the oxidation of glucose to pyruvate. So in this case, both are right. So we just have to be aware what are the names and what is the general process that is happening, and see if they are in the correct order. So to do that, I just have to remind you that this is the order, and these are the processes that are happening. The beginning is glycolysis. The second one is pyruvate oxidation. The third one is the citric acid cycle, and Here is the oxidative phosphorylation. So I'm just color coded to make it easier for you. So for example, A is right away wrong because the first process will be glycolysis. So, and they put it as a third one. So they start with the second one. So this is wrong. B, start with the right one, is glycolysis. However, in B, the second process is the last one. So the B is wrong. And I want to grab your attention to this TCA cycle. TCA cycle. So this citric acid cycle is also called Krebs cycle or also TCA cycle. It could have these names. TCA stands for 3-carboxylic acid cycle. So all these ones is the same name. Okay, let's go to C. So C is the oxidation of glucose of 2-pyruvate. This is exactly the definition of glycolysis. If you see glucose oxidated to pyruvate, good. Oxidation of pyruvate or pyruvate oxidation, this is correct. Then the oxidation of the acetyl coenzyme A, this is correct. And finally the oxidative phosphorylation, this is correct. So C seems to be the correct answer, but let's try to see what happened with D. Glycolysis is correct. The reduction of pyruvate, no, this is wrong. Remember that we are going in the opposite direction. We are not doing reductions here. We are doing oxidation, so this is wrong. TCA is correct. Oxidative phosphorylation is correct. So there is one that is wrong. So the answer will be C. So to summarize, C is the right one, while the other ones have one of the process that is wrong or incorrect. Okay, now let's try to answer this one. The function of cellular respiration is what? So clearly, and you see that A is correct, but let's try to analyze the other ones. So clearly the answer is A. The idea of the cellular respiration is to produce ATP. The reduce CO2 is not the answer. Extract CO2 from the atmosphere is even wrong because we are actually doing the opposite. Produce carbohydrate. We are not even producing carbohydrate. We're breaking it into smaller pieces and synthesize macromolecules from monomers. This is also wrong. So the only answer that is possible is A. So now this question during this reaction, and here you have carbohydrate, possibly glucose. Here you have oxygen. Here you release CO2 and water. So this is cellular respiration. And which compound is reduced? So this is very easy. We already did solve this question. And the oxygen that is being reduced is the oxygen because it's gaining electrons here. So let's try to see what is happening. So as we said, oxygen is the right answer because here it's gaining the hydrogen atoms, the electrons. So it's being reduced, and let's see it at the molecular level, what happened with the electrons. So here, if you remember, with the oxygen, here they are sharing the electrons at a similar distance, so they are relatively far. However, when you see the oxygen, the electrons are much closer, so it's being reduced. So remember, here the electrons between oxygen and water, they are far in the oxygen, while they are much closer in the water, much closer to the oxygen. So as a result, the electrons are pulled closer to the oxygen, so the oxygen is being reduced. Okay, now where do the reaction of glycolysis occur in a eukaryotic cell? So let's analyze this option and try to see which one is the correct one. So if you remember, glycolysis is the first process in cellular respiration, and so there are three processes that take place inside of the cell, of the mitochondria, while the other one takes place in the cytosol. And the one that happened in the cytosol will be the glycolysis because it's the first one. So the answer, without a doubt, will be D. So cytosol is the right answer. Here, the glycolysis, while the other three take place inside of the mitochondria. Okay, this answer is relatively, or this question is relatively easy. Which process is the one in which glucose is oxidized to generate two molecules of pyruvate? So if you remember, in the beginning you have glucose, and the first step is to turn it into pyruvate. So oxidize it, and this process is called glycolysis. So it's not fermentation, it's not Krebs cycle, it's not chemiosmosis. It has is not the oxidation of pyruvate. So the correct answer is E. So here they're talking about this process where you take glucose and you produce two pyruvate molecules. You produce ATP through substrate phosphorylation, and you produce 2-NADH. So this answer is the correct one, while the other ones are incorrect. Okay, which of the following best describe the electron transport chain? So maybe there are some of them that they are correct. We have to look for the best one. And if you remember the electron transport chain, you have different carriers that transport the electrons, and you create a gradient, and then after you have that gradient, you will have here oxygen, and this produce here will accept the electrons to produce water, and every small step you produce you're gaining a little energy. So if you read A, this is a perfect definition because it's passing, electrons are passed from one carrier to another one, and it's exactly what we studied, and they are releasing energy at each step. So that is perfect. But let's see if there is a better answer. Let's read B. Glucose is broken down to a 3-compound carbon. This is the definition of glycolysis. This is wrong. In preparation for the citric acid, this part is also wrong because this is in preparation. Yeah, anyway, this answer is wrong. Let's read C. Electrons are pumped across the membrane. This part is right. By active transport, this is wrong. We are not spending energy, we are producing energy. The acetyl coenzyme A is full oxidized to CO2. This is the definition of the Krebs cycle. So this is wrong. So far all of these ones are wrong. And this one, hydrogen atoms are added to CO2. So let's see. So you have hydrogen atoms added to CO2 to make an energy-rich compound. So what they are saying, if you take these two compounds and you make one that is energy rich, so you make a carbohydrate. So what they are describing here is called photosynthesis. So this is not the electron transport change. So the best answer, it will be A. And if you remember the video lecture, uh, 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 we talk that in an uncontrolled reaction, this process can produce an explosive release of heat and light. And this is what happened when you have a shuttle that go to space. They use the same reaction. However, as we talk in the video lecture and you saw in the video, in the textbook, the electron transport change allowed to do this in a controlled manner and to gather ATP. So this question, they ask you, they said fermentation is essentially glycolysis plus an extra step. And what is that extra step? So to answer this question, we can see this schematic. So if you remember, the first step that we studied was glycolysis, and you break the glucose into two pyruvate molecules, and generally you move into the mitochondria. However, when you have oxygen, you need to go through another path that is in the cytosol, that is the fermentation, and the key step here is that you take to be able to do fermentation, you need to oxidize the NAD plus again. So you need to go from reduce the NADH to an oxidized NAD plus. So as I said, the is correct one. The glycolysis is the one that produces the ATP, while the next step will be the regeneration of the NAD plus. Here there is not generation of ATP, so this is the right one. Let's try to see if there is another answer that could be correct. A, remove poisonous oxygen from the environment. At high concentration, oxygen could be bad, but this is not explaining anything, so this is wrong. That prevents pyruvate from accumulating, and to some degree this is right, but it's not answering the question, so this is wrong. Extract a bit more energy from glucose. No, this is wrong. What we are doing is trying to regenerate this. So the right answer will be D. Okay, this question seems to be very long and complicated, but it's actually very easy. And they are asking you what happened when you're in a classroom with too many people. What happened with the levels of CO2 and the temperature? So it's very easy, as you have so many people breathing and maybe some of them even sleeping in the classroom. What is going to happen is that you're going to have a lot of CO2 and you are going to release also energy in form of heat. So the temperature and the level of carbon dioxide is going to increase because they are byproducts of the cellular respiration as we see in this schematic. So although it's a very long question, it's actually very easy. So the oxygen is going to reduce and the CO2 and the heat is going to increase. So B, definitely right, and the other ones are wrong. For example, A, talk about that there is no increase in temperature or carbon dioxide. Why? Because the cellular respiration is 100% efficient. So here they were saying is that there is no entropy. There is not of a release of heat because of entropy, and this is wrong. See, the temperature goes up and the level of the carbon dioxide goes down. This is just wrong because it's in photosynthesis, but even in photosynthesis we will have a cellular respiration too. So yeah, so this is wrong. The temperature goes up, but carbon dioxide remain constant. This is wrong because as we said, there will be an increase of CO2 and reduction of oxygen. The temperature goes down and carbon dioxide remain constant. So all of them are wrong, and if you keep reading, you will see more holes in the other answers or more gaps and wrong things that are there. So I try to answer all the questions. If you have any doubt, just let me know. And good luck in your test that is getting closer. Have a good day. Bye.